We are in the home stretch in our study of Deuteronomy. And we're looking at the very last words of Moses. As he is on the banks of the Jordan River, the last month of his life, he believes it is loving to offer a lengthy warning for people who are about to enter the promised land. And the people he's talking to, and we need to keep this in mind, all the people he's talking to have only experienced poverty. But it's the same kind of poverty. It's not a different level. It's all the same level, which means the tens of thousands of people Moses is addressing, they all have the same bank accounts, they all have the same pantries, they all have the same closets, they all have the same homes. It's all the same size. It's pretty much nothing. Exactly the same. No one's closet's bigger. There's no levels of poorness or poverty. They are all on the exact same playing field, and they have been for nearly 40 years. When they cross over the Jordan River and inherit the promised land, a gift that God is giving them, that is all about to change. Because when safety occurs and opportunity is there, the reality we all know sitting in this room is that some people succeed in those circumstances and some people struggle. And so, what we are looking at as we head into the last section of warnings in Deuteronomy, Moses addresses something that these people have no idea what it feels like, and that is to be in a different tax bracket than the person next to you or the person next to them. They've all been exactly the same spot. They don't know what it's like for some to succeed and some to struggle. They all know the same. We're all struggling. Not only are we struggling, we're all struggling the exact same amount. This is about to change. And so Moses provides warnings that we could probably relate to, since we know what it's like to live in different tax brackets. Everyone in here, we've got tax brackets covered just in our church fellowship alone. So I think it's important to listen to these announcements. They are specific when things change, and now there's different levels of people, different sized homes, pantries, closets, bank accounts. So let's look at it here. We get into the last section of hazards that only come with happiness, and the next one that Moses is going to address is the hazard of being insensitive, which isn't there when everyone is exactly the same. But when there become different levels of success and struggling, it's easy to become insensitive, according to what Moses says. So look with me in chapter 24, verse 19. Moses says, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back and get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Now, I don't know if you know what a sheaf is, because when we farm, for all of our lifetimes, we haven't really used sheaves. We've got machines that make these things for us. But I put a picture of an ancient sheaf on the screen so you could at least see what one looks like. A sheaf is when you have cut the stalks and you have carefully bundled them together. It's not just this haphazard pile of leaves sitting around. You have carefully put these things together into a size that you can physically carry from wherever it is into your wagon or your cart or whatever mechanism you are using to transport it to the next thing. The contraption that carries these things are not large, and some people carry like 3 or 4 or 6 of these, depending on how big your shoulders are, as they walk along. So I want you to keep that in mind. That's significant when he says, when you are harvesting your field, and as you go through a field, you have little piles of these sheaves, all these little bundles. It says, as you're harvesting and you forget one, let it be. Do you know the odds of forgetting one of these things? It's pretty low. Because you're not having to pick up all of them at one time and walk a mile. You're only carrying them a little ways. Or you're wrapping them on top of the oxen that you have to carry them to the threshing floor. So when he says, when you are harvesting and you overlook a sheaf, it hardly ever happened. It's almost like Moses is suggesting, why don't you overlook a sheaf? This is something that you personally have taken a lot of effort to construct and make just the right size, and you have cut it down and put it together. So I want you to see that picture as we move on. When that happens, leave it. And he says, leave it for the fatherless, the foreigner, and the widow. And that's the background of all the beggars they had in their culture. So don't pick it up, put it on your shoulder, carry it, and give it to someone who's a foreigner, or give it to someone who is a widow or a fatherless. Don't do that. Better yet, leave it. Leave it right where it sits or where it leans. If there's a pile of 4 of them, feel free to overlook one of them and just grab 3. Why? Well, if you have only experienced prosperity, you have no idea why. And most of us in this room, that's our life. Most of us have only known prosperity. Different levels of it, but that's all we've known. God is setting up a system where beggars don't have to beg. Because God is concerned with something quite highly that becomes insensitive once everything is changing, and that is dignity. God is not just interested in these people's survival, He's also clearly interested in the dignity of human beings. And there is dignity in grabbing one of these for yourself and you taking care of it yourself, rather than someone giving you a hand. Someone who has selected how much you should have and given it to you, rather. And he goes into lots of other things in chapter 24 about the olive branch. Quit whacking the olive branch after a certain time and let people go pick the olives themselves. The foreigners, the fatherless, the widows. Let them do it themselves. Let those people go pick these up themselves. Because, this is key, there is dignity in choice. There's a lot of dignity in choice. And when you take choice away from someone, even in kindness, even in the prepackaged handout you are giving, isn't that kind? Yeah, it's kind. But if you determine what someone needs, that is you taking away at least a part of their dignity. There's a church in Chicago that I respect a lot, and they opened up a food pantry for the neighborhood they lived in. And they set it up like a grocery store. And they said there was no model for this as they were constructing it, because every other food pantry or whatever they had seen, the organization or the building decides what package of groceries you need for the week or whatever, and they hand it to you. And they said, I don't think God works that way. We want these people to experience choice. Not telling them what they need. Let them go and pick. Are some people going to abuse that system? Say yes. Yes, of course. That's what happens. I want you to hear the heartbeat of God for the dignity of human beings, not just for their existence. So he says, overlook the sheaf. But that's not the only place he says it. In chapter 25, verse 4, he says something else very similarly. He says, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. They don't even know what it's like to have an ox or to have grain. So when they do, and they actually get to farm, and I've got a picture of this because we have machines to do this. You don't even know what it looks like. But they basically make this, they pile the grain in a circle, and they take these 2 very large animals and walk them over the grain because they are pounding out the cornflakes for you. Very sanitary. Because there's no one walking behind the ox to catch stuff. But he says, don't muzzle the ox. In other words, if they want to stop for a second and eat some of the food, some of your food, let them. Yeah, but isn't that going to make this thing take longer? Yeah, it'll take longer by letting them do that. But you'll make your ox happy. And the farmer in me goes, who cares if ox are happy? They're ox. Are they alive? Good, that's enough for them. What's the level of their feelings? I need to be not only sensitive to the fatherless, the foreigner, and the widow, but now I need to be sensitive to oxen. And I hear God saying a principle behind all of this. If you're an employer, I'd listen carefully. For those that work for you, that you help make sure that they're enjoying their work, that they're not just doing it. There's far more things that God is concerned with other than productivity. There's a book I read about 5 years ago. It's a fantastic book. If you're an employer, feel free to start taking some notes and write this down. It's called 3 Signs of a Miserable Job by Pat Lencioni. Fantastic book. And everything he talked about in that book was something that you just couldn't touch or wasn't tangible. Shouldn't Christians be the best employers? If you believe that what you have is actually provided for by God Himself, if you believe that, then those who work for you, are you interested in just their productivity or are you interested in their joy? Even if it creates more work for you, because if you let this ox unmuzzled eat some of the grain, guaranteed it's going to go through the ox's system and you'll have to clean the grain. If you don't let them eat it, you even save yourself time because you don't have to clean the mess they're not going to make because they're not eating. But he says, don't muzzle the ox. Treat those who help you out really well, even if it takes away from your pocketbook and your time. Don't be insensitive to them, not even oxen. And then something else, it's a different kind of insensitivity. It's back in chapter 23. Moses says, when you are encamped against your enemies, keep away from everything impure. And then you see a long list of impurities, and he says the reason for this in verse 14. For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy. This is instructions for what to do with your camp because, listen carefully, God chooses to move about within your camp. This is big. This means there isn't just God moving about in the temple and God moving about in your home. He moves about everywhere. There is no place where God cannot and will not be. Therefore, even in a place where you wouldn't even think it would matter, keep that place holy, because with God there is not temple life and work life and camp life and recreational life. There is just life. But I don't want you to miss the power of what verse 14 says. He says, the Lord your God moves about in your camp. Now I want you to stop and think for a second. Do you feel like God is moving about in your camp? As you look at your life, that's your camp, that's your life. Do you feel God moving about in that camp? Or are you going, I don't think He's moving about in my camp. I see Him moving about in her camp and probably his camp, but not mine. Some of us don't treat our thoughts or our words like God is moving about in our camp. I mean, there's a joke that is constantly told about the ride to church and then when you're actually in church. And sometimes the worst that we behave is in the ride going to church. But then when it's time to get in church, let's get it together because now we're going to go where God is. I've seen this happen as an athlete constantly, where people riding in their cars up to a church gym to play basketball are awful. Then when they get in the gym, they change gears. We can't talk like that in here because God is apparently in the gym but not in the car. That's silly. You should laugh at that. That's preposterous. But it's so easy for us to take our thoughts captive when we're here or when we're doing something religious, but not when we're taking a shower or working out or whatever we're doing at 3 o'clock or getting off work or when it's Saturday and it's our day. It's so easy once we are prosperous, once we are safe, and once we have opportunity to just compartmentalize God. Okay, He's in that part of life. Sunday we'll think about that, but not these days. Not right now. But he says, even make your camp holy because God moves about in your camp. That's impressive. The second hazard we'll look at today. Not only do we become insensitive when things start going our way, apparently, according to Moses, we also get confused when things start going our way. Prosperity doesn't always bring clarity. Sometimes it brings confusion. Because most of us want to protect and maintain our opportunities and our resources and our safety. We want to keep that. So what do we need to do to make sure we don't lose our safety or our resources or our opportunities? Something very small that Moses says in chapter 23, verse 1. It's so profound, so I need to talk about it just for a minute. Underneath this hazard of being confused. He says, no one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord. Now, I need to talk about what that means for a moment, but I want you to see nobody who participates in whatever this stuff is may enter the assembly of the Lord. Emasculating and cutting are practices that are normally associated with a religious, spiritual idea called asceticism. And those who are involved in asceticism, and in India particularly has a pretty high concentration of these, even to this day. The Western Hemisphere hasn't really seen a lot of it, but the Eastern Hemisphere has. Asceticism believes that the flesh and everything physical is a problem. It's always getting in the way of what is spiritual. And what is spiritual is way better than what is physical. So for me to be in tune with spiritual stuff, I have got to either eliminate physical things or make sure I am not taking advantage of them. And so I will cut and punish my physical body to do that. Emasculating is a terrible practice that guys use to eliminate unholy desires. And so they would destroy their bodies, their outside bodies, because they had desires they believed were not godly, so they broke their bodies so they wouldn't have those kind of desires. Very extreme. Another form of this that isn't mentioned here is some ascetics would weld an iron gate around their neck. 3 foot by 3 foot. So if they had to do anything with their face, if their fly was on their nose, how hard is it to get a fly off of your nose if you have to go around a gate or feed yourself? That was the point. Try laying down with an iron gate around your head. Some people spent decades like this because they believed the spiritual is great, the physical is constantly getting in the way. If it wasn't for all this stuff, if it wasn't for the flesh, if it wasn't for the world, I could focus on God a lot more. So I will destroy my physical life, or I will hide out. A lot of these people just hid out in caves to get away from the worldly distractions. Not only are we not going to a movie, we're not going to a restaurant, we're not going outside. So as to eliminate distractions, and then, okay, now we're godly. And God stops them and says, look, if you're trying to protect your opportunities and your resources by this spiritual drawing near, and you do it through cutting and emasculating, you got another thing coming. That is not how I work. If that's how you work, do not come into my assembly. That's the exact opposite of how God works. God is not about crushing desire. God is not about crushing desire. He is about unleashing desire. He made us with passions and desires. Now, unfortunately for us, we tend to aim them in places that aren't very fulfilling. But his answer to that isn't to crush desire or to punish yourself for having those. It's to do a course correction and aim it at the right place. And he explains this a little further down in chapter 23. It's kind of in code for us, so let me decodify it. He says, do not despise an Edomite, for the Edomites are related to you. The people he's talking to are descendants of Jacob, and Jacob is spiritually blessed. Jacob's descendants are loved by God. and they draw near to God. They are the spiritual giants of their day. The Edomites are descended from Esau, and they just care about stuff in the flesh, and they don't really care about anything spiritual, just about the flesh. So Jacob is a spiritual reference, Israelites, and Edomites and Esau are a fleshly reference. Do you know how Jacob and Esau were related? Brothers, twin brothers, pretty closely related. And so he says, don't despise your flesh, spiritual people, because your flesh and your spirit are tied together like twin brothers. And cutting and crushing means you think they're way apart and one is in the way of the other. That is not true. The flesh is not the problem. So don't despise that. And then he says later on in verse 7, do not despise an Egyptian, because you resided there as foreigners in their country. And the Egyptian is the world. That's geography. It's where you live. Don't despise them either. Don't hate your environment. Don't hate your desires. Don't hate your environment. This is not a message on Hebrews, but it's worth taking a minute to talk about this because we're almost done. Hebrews says that Jesus was tempted in every way that we were. Now, I don't want you to write this down because that's pretty vulnerable. I at least want you to think about it. What tempts you? What awful things tempt you? Let's make it clear. I'm sure an all-broccoli diet doesn't tempt anybody. What tempts you? What unholy, unhelpful, selfish, sinful things tempt you? Okay, think about it. Do you believe that Jesus Christ wanted everything that you just thought of? Not only everything you thought of, everything everybody just thought of. Do you believe that? Because the nature of temptation means you want it, correct? It's desire. It means you want it. Did Jesus want everything you thought of? Did Jesus want to escape pain? Did Jesus want everyone to like him? Did Jesus choose to numb the things going on with his life? Did he want to numb those things by spending lots of money or being involved in pornography or getting involved in substance abuse? Did he want to do that? The answer should be, according to Hebrews, yes, he wanted to do that. He wanted everything that was awful. He wanted it. If he didn't want it, then he wouldn't be tempted by it. Like the all-broccoli diet. So the point is, the problem is not the desire. The problem is caving into the desire, feeling like you're a passenger in this life, not a driver. Jesus did not cave into those things he wanted. Instead, here's what he did instead. When those things made promises, and substances, and awful relationships, and unholy hobbies, all of that, greed, they all make promises. And Jesus went, man, that sounds really good. But instead, I'm going to believe the promise that God has said throughout his word more than the promise this thing is making. That's how he fought it. That's how he fought temptation. He fought it by believing in promises from God's word, specifically Deuteronomy. Do you believe that those things that God says, the promises, are actually more fulfilling and more true than the promises that drugs make, the promises that fornication makes, the promises that greed makes? Do you believe that? That's how Jesus fought it. It wasn't to escape temptation. It wasn't to shield himself from it. He tackled it head on. He went to a place called the wilderness where temptation reigned and fought it. And as John prayed, we have the Spirit of God. And as Paul told Timothy, our spirit is not a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and self-discipline. We can fight temptation. The answer is not seclusion or punishing. or killing desire. It's just aiming it at the right things, believing which things will actually come through and which things won't. Deuteronomy 27, verse 7. As he's talking about the altar of the Lord, Moses says, sacrifice fellowship offerings there, eating them and rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God. Moses is constantly urging these people to, once they get into the promised land, meet up with other people and spend time celebrating. Now, he said this a number of times, but he's never said it about fellowship offerings. Fellowship offerings in the Old Testament are the same thing as peace offerings. And what's interesting about these things, whatever you call them, is they're the only one not commanded by God. It's a free will offering, which is another name for it, which means hopefully when you get over there, I urge you to be moved to a point to go spend time with people that's not commanded to. You don't have to. Go do it. Do it in such a way where there is celebrating and rejoicing and eating. This is good for us to hear. One of the reasons I like pews instead of chairs is because you have to touch somebody. Some of us are kind of bad at that. We like a little real estate between us and the next person, and I get that. But when we start getting our way, how easy is it to get the bigger house? The big house out from the town, away from town, in the gated community, where there's a security guard that allows people in and out. It makes you safe. It does make you safe. It just also makes you completely untouchable. And God knows, when some of them start succeeding, and they will, that's what's going to happen. Prosperity tends to make us isolate ourselves. Not because we're evil either. Some of us have things, resources, and this new home that we have to work hard to maintain. And so it's not even a matter of physically we're away from people. We're just time-wise away from people. We're so busy doing our thing, we're not intentionally getting involved in others' lives. Not because we're evil, but as Hebrews 10, which we'll put it on the screen, tells us, some of you are in the habit of doing this. Don't isolate yourselves. It's so easy to do that. When your tax bracket goes here, 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 and here, just get bigger, bigger, wider, spread out, spread. And if you read Deuteronomy, you cannot miss this. It's in almost every chapter. Stop. Fellowship. Eat. Rejoice. It's all over. Don't get confused about that. And then this is the last one I'll read you. It's in Deuteronomy 28. Last warning in this confused section. And this is confusing. He says, because you did not serve the Lord your God joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity, therefore in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and dire poverty, you will serve the enemies the Lord sends against you. He'll put an iron yoke around your neck until he has destroyed you. Doing our duty, obeying the rules, is not the main point. When the opportunities and the safety comes and the resources begin to build and you want to protect those and maintain those and not lose them, don't miss this very important warning from Moses. Keeping those does not mean going to church every Sunday, reading your Bible an hour every day, giving this much of your income. That's not what it's about. God seems awfully concerned about the why you're doing any of it. And when prosperity comes, it's supposed to ignite joy. And it usually does. For stuff, not God. But he says, if you can maintain your joy, if you can serve the Lord your God gladly and joyfully in prosperity, what you are doing for yourself and everyone around you is you are showing, I have renounced my identity being based on what the world says should make me happy. That's not me. So when stuff comes, hey, great, we have stuff. When stuff goes, oh, rats, we lost stuff. It makes me happy when we have it and sad when we don't, but that's it. I have not made it when I get it, and I'm not crushed when I don't have it. Doesn't mean I'm unemotional. It just means this stuff, these opportunities, this safety is not who I am. I'll mourn it when it's gone, and I'll celebrate it when I have it. But that's it, because it's all a gift. Easy come, easy go. But one thing that will never go, according to Paul in Romans, and I cannot wait to look at Romans chapter 8 this Christmas season, is the love of Christ. It will never go. It will never fade. It's a treasure that won't tarnish or get stolen or misplaced.